April 1945. The war was ending, but the fire still burned inside the barracks near Remagen. Smoke rose from a courtyard piled with the gray and green remnants of an army that no longer existed. Wehrmacht uniforms, insignias, and caps, symbols once worn with pride, were now tossed into barrels and set ablaze. The smell of wool and oil mixed with the damp air. Around the flames stood defeated soldiers, their faces hollow, their orders clear. Nothing of the past was to survive. Among them was Otto Krüger, a tailor from Hamburg, drafted 3 years earlier to mend uniforms and patch bullet holes in men he rarely knew. His hands were trembling not from fear, but from what they were forced to destroy. The officer shouted again, his voice cracking, "No one will wear this shame again!" Otto looked down at his sewing kit, small scissors, a handful of needles, a tin of thread. He hesitated, then slipped one tool into his coat pocket, a pair of heavy, curved shears with a dull brass handle. The officer saw it. "Leave it, Krüger. We're finished sewing lies." But Otto didn't drop it. He turned away as the flames reached a pile of greatcoats, their buttons popping like gunfire. For 10 years, those shears had stitched banners, uniforms, and funeral bands. They had cut fabric for victory parades and later for field burials. He thought perhaps this was their final act, silent witness to the collapse of a nation's costume. A week later, the Americans arrived. The sound of their trucks echoed through the valley, big square vehicles marked with white stars, driven by men who looked both young and impossibly confident. The German prisoners were lined up in the yard, hands behind their heads. An MP with a red armband walked slowly past the rows, scanning faces. He stopped in front of Otto, looked down at the frayed thread around his wrist, and asked a simple question. "You, Tailor?" Otto nodded. The MP gestured toward a tent near the road where stretchers were being unloaded. "We need you." For a moment, Otto thought it was a trick. Maybe they wanted to mock him, force him to sew American uniforms as humiliation. But when he entered the tent, what he saw froze him. Inside lay wounded soldiers, some American, some German. Bandages, antiseptic, groans. A nurse was struggling to cut fabric for splints. The MP pointed at the scissors in Otto's hand. "Use those," he said. Otto took a breath. His hands remembered their craft before his mind did. He began to cut. Cloth for bandages, torn sleeves for compresses. He had cut so many times before, for efficiency, for obedience, for war. But now, with every slice, something unfamiliar entered his movements. Purpose. That night, he sat outside the tent, sharpening his scissors against a stone. He listened to the sound of American laughter drifting from the camp kitchen. It felt wrong to hear joy, yet it reminded him of home before everything turned gray. He looked at his hands in the moonlight, hands that had once made uniforms for generals, now trimming cloth for the wounded of both armies. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Wherever you are in the world, share your location and local time in the comments. Someone, somewhere, may be listening at the same hour. Otto Krüger first realized that the war had finally stopped needing his scissors for death. The scissors gleamed under a weak beam of morning light that crept through the tent flap. They were old, heavier than they looked, and their handles bore tiny nicks, scars from years of war sewing. Otto Krüger held them in silence, running his thumb along the cold brass. Those blades had once cut military banners for parades in Hamburg, sleeves for fallen comrades in Narva, and even a widow's mourning band after Stalingrad. He used to joke with fellow tailors that his scissors had seen more battles than any rifle. Now, in 1945, they cut bandages instead of uniforms. He had been assigned to the American Field Hospital on the Rhine's western bank, a makeshift sanctuary housed in the shell of an old railway depot. The roof still bore shrapnel holes, and when rain came, it fell through in rhythmic taps onto the metal tables. Around him, German nurses worked beside American medics, an uneasy truce stitched together by necessity. The wounded came in waves, carried from trucks that smelled of diesel and blood. Otto's corner of the room looked almost peaceful, a table stacked with torn shirts, bed linens, and discarded U.S. jackets. The Americans had given him soap, a spool of white thread, and coffee, strong, bitter, almost burnt. He hadn't tasted coffee in months. "Make them last," the orderly warned. Otto only nodded. Every sip felt like both a gift and a reminder that he was still alive. As he worked, his scissors moved with deliberate rhythm. Snip, fold, stitch. He realized each cut now carried meaning beyond the fabric. He was cutting through old loyalties, through the habit of fear that had ruled his hands. For the first time, he whispered, "My hands are cutting for healing." He wrote those words that night on a scrap torn from an American supply box, tucked it into his pocket. Years later, when someone asked what changed him, that piece of cardboard would still carry the faint trace of ink and blood. The Americans respected his skill. They called him Mr. Krüger, pronouncing it clumsily but with warmth. Sometimes a nurse would leave him small kindnesses, a biscuit, a fresh spool, a bit of laughter he wasn't sure how to return. Other German prisoners in the camp mocked him at first. "Sewing for them?" One spat, "You'll never be German again." But Otto no longer knew what that meant. He remembered his son, Hans, 15, missing since January. He remembered his wife, Margaret, writing her last letter before the bombs fell on Hamburg. What flag did any of them live under now? That night, he used his scissors to trim gauze for an American corporal whose arm had been shattered by a shell. The corporal said quietly, "You've got steady hands." Otto didn't reply. He simply kept cutting, each slice soft and sure. Outside, the sound of rain on metal mingled with distant artillery. For once, Otto wasn't afraid of what the morning would bring. His scissors had outlived the Reich. They were still working, still useful, still kind. He fell asleep at his table, hands open, blades resting gently across his palm. When dawn came, the light caught the edge of the scissors, making them glow as if they had found a new purpose in the ruins. By the third week, the camp had changed. The wounded were fewer, but the tension was thicker. Some German prisoners had begun helping with chores, building fences, unloading crates, sweeping corridors. Yet the old lines still lingered. Who had been the conqueror? Who the conquered? Otto Krüger's corner, though, had become its own small republic. He was no longer watched closely. His scissors and thread had earned him quiet authority. One late afternoon, as the wind whipped through the broken windows of the depot, Otto decided to patch a tear in one of the hospital's tent flaps. It was a minor thing, a draft that annoyed the nurses, but when he looked for cloth, all that remained were two flags, a tattered German one found in a locker and a weather-worn American flag used to cover a crate of supplies. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then he sat down, drew the two pieces together, and began to sew. The needle passed through the black, red, and gold, then through the red, white, and blue. It was simple, mechanical, yet the sound of each puncture felt enormous in the quiet. A medic stopped to watch, then another. Finally, a young sergeant from Ohio leaned on the doorway, his voice half amusement, half disbelief. "Never thought I'd see our flags stitched together," he said. Otto looked up but said nothing. He tied the thread, pulled the seam tight, and hung the patched curtain back over the flap. The wind stopped sneaking in. For a brief instant, there was warmth. That evening, the story spread through the camp. Some found it poetic, others blasphemous. "The tailor's sewing peace," joked one nurse. "Or trying to," another added quietly. In truth, Otto hadn't meant to make a statement. He just wanted to keep the cold out. But as night fell and the stitched curtain fluttered gently between bunks, he saw what it had become, a quiet symbol of something he couldn't yet name. Later, at dinner, he overheard a conversation that would haunt him. Two American soldiers were arguing over what to do with captured officers. One said they deserved trials, the other muttered that they should all hang. Otto cut his bread in silence, listening. He realized the hatred went both ways. The war might have ended, but it hadn't finished working through men's hearts. That night, he returned to his workbench, unable to sleep. The patched curtain swayed in the moonlight, half one color, half another. He ran his fingers over the seam, smooth, strong, invisible from a distance. Perhaps that was how peace was built, he thought, from stitches no one noticed. He wrote again in his diary, "Today I sewed a border that did not bleed." The words were simple, but for him, they felt like a confession. Outside, an American Jeep started up, headlights sweeping briefly across the curtain. For a heartbeat, both flags shone as one. Then the light moved on, and the tent returned to darkness, its seams holding quietly against the wind. The summer heat pressed down on the camp, thick and heavy with the scent of iron and sweat. The wounded healed slowly, and the rhythm of work in the tailor's corner settled into something almost human. Otto Krüger mended uniforms for whoever brought them. German guards, American soldiers, even the Belgian volunteers who wandered through in mismatched boots. The sound of his needle was steady, the heartbeat of a man relearning patience. One morning, a young black medic named Corporal Lewis approached his table carrying a bundle of olive green jackets. He was from Alabama, his accent smooth and deliberate. "Need these sleeves shortened," he said, unfolding a jacket with one arm while steadying a prosthetic hook with the other. Otto nodded, tracing the seams with careful fingers. "For men who've lost more than cloth," Lewis added quietly. The words stayed with Otto long after the corporal left. That afternoon, they worked side by side. Lewis measured, Otto cut. Sometimes they spoke through gestures, sometimes through fragments of English and German. When Otto admired the medic's steady movements, Lewis grinned. "Sewing's like jazz," he said. "You keep the rhythm, don't fight the tune." Otto didn't understand, but he smiled anyway. Over the next days, their conversations deepened. Lewis told him about his mother, who'd been a seamstress in Birmingham before the Depression. Otto told him about his shop in Hamburg, his son's school uniform, the blue fabric his wife once loved. The two men, born in worlds that would never have met without the war, shared a language made of thread and small talk. One evening, a group of German prisoners stopped at the tent door. They stared at Lewis, their eyes cold. One muttered a word Otto wished he hadn't heard, the same insult he'd heard from SS officers in occupied France. The medic froze. Otto felt the air tighten like cloth before a tear. He stood slowly and said in German, "He's a better man than any of us were." Silence fell. The prisoners left. Later that night, Lewis handed Otto a torn patch of canvas. "For practice," he said. It was a piece of an American flag damaged during transport. Otto repaired it carefully, making the stitches invisible. When he gave it back, Lewis placed his hand on Otto's shoulder. "Doesn't matter what color the cloth is," he said, "so long as it holds." In the dim light, Otto looked at his own hands. The same hands that had once sewn eagles onto black uniforms now mending stars onto blue. He realized that the fabric he worked with was no longer just material. It was memory. And with each thread he pulled, he was unlearning something poisonous. He returned to his cot, too restless to sleep. The scissors lay beside him, gleaming faintly. He thought of Lewis's words, "So long as it holds." Perhaps that was what peace meant. Not agreement, but endurance. Two men who should have been enemies, sitting under one lamp, repairing what their nations had torn apart. Outside, the river murmured beyond the camp. Inside, the sound of the needle continued, binding two histories with a single thread. By September 1945, the camp near Remagen had grown quieter. The hospital tents stood like pale ghosts in the morning fog, their seams stained by months of rain and disinfectant. Otto Krüger had become indispensable. When a sleeve tore, when a coat ripped, when a bandage strap snapped, someone would call for the tailor. He was still a prisoner, but no one reminded him anymore. His shears hung on the wall beside the Red Cross flag, and that alone felt like freedom. One afternoon, an American lieutenant named Robert Hayes entered the tent. His right arm was in a sling, his jacket folded neatly over his good shoulder. He had a sharp, tired face, the kind men get after seeing too much too young. He set the jacket down and said quietly, "Can you fix this? It belonged to my brother." Otto turned it over. The fabric was torn across the chest, dark with a dried stain that hadn't fully washed out. He carried it to the wash basin, filled it with cold water, and began to scrub. Once, twice, a third time. The stain faded, but never disappeared. He rubbed harder, his knuckles raw. Still red. Still there. He looked at the lieutenant and whispered, "It won't come out." Hayes gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's all right. He'd rather it stayed." Then he walked out, leaving Otto alone with the jacket. That night, Otto sat under the lantern, needle in hand. Every time he pushed it through the cloth, the bloodstain caught the light. He remembered the faces of men he'd fitted for dress uniforms before they marched east, men who never came back. He remembered the orders he'd followed without thought, The silence he'd accepted as loyalty. And now, with this jacket, he was sewing inside that silence. Each stitch was a question he could never ask aloud. When dawn came, he hung the finished jacket by the entrance, folded carefully like an offering. The lieutenant returned, ran his fingers across the mended fabric, and said simply, "Thank you." Otto didn't answer. Words felt too thin. The lieutenant reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 coins, and laid them on the table. Otto tried to refuse. Hayes shook his head. A man's work deserves a wage. It was the first time Otto had been paid since before the war. That evening, he wrote to his wife, or perhaps just to memory, since he didn't know if she was alive. "I am paid again," he wrote, "not for war, but for hands." The line trembled slightly, the ink blotting at the edge. He looked at his reflection in the basin, thinner, older, quieter. The bloodstain on his sleeve caught his eye, faint but still visible. He realized then that not every mark can be washed away. Some must be carried, not as guilt, but as witness. To you watching now, what would you have done if you were Otto? Would you have scrubbed the stain or kept it as a reminder? Tell me in the comments. I wonder how you see the weight of mercy when it's paid in thread instead of justice. Outside, the camp bell rang for supper. Otto folded his hands and whispered a simple prayer, not for forgiveness, but for steadiness. Autumn came with the smell of wet leaves and coal smoke drifting from the American kitchens. The war had ended 5 months earlier, yet inside the Remagen camp, men still lived between defeat and survival. Otto Krüger's scissors no longer trembled in his hand. They had found a rhythm that felt almost like life before uniforms had meaning. He now led a small group of German prisoners assigned to mend supplies for the hospital and nearby orphan shelters. Each morning, an officer would hand him a ledger, pages filled with numbers, orders, quantities. 70 blankets repaired, 30 coats altered. The Americans ran the camp like a factory of compassion, and Otto had become its quiet foreman. It amazed him that the same country capable of building the B-24 bomber every 63 minutes could also build trust with scraps of cloth and 5-cent wages. One day, a supply truck arrived carrying a new load of torn uniforms. The driver joked, "Your production beats Detroit." Otto smiled shyly, unsure if he was allowed to laugh, but that night he counted the work himself. 118 jackets, 42 trousers, 67 caps, all repaired by hands that once stitched eagles and lightning bolts. In a single week, his corner had restored more fabric than his old Hamburg shop did in a month. When the Americans paid him, he tried again to refuse. They insisted. "This isn't charity," said a sergeant. "It's payroll." He tucked the coins away and wondered how many German prisoners across the continent were doing the same. Later, he would learn the figure. 370,000 Germans in American hands were given labor assignments: farmers, carpenters, cooks, tailors. They earned 80 cents a day, enough to buy letters, soap, or cigarettes. It wasn't punishment. It was rehabilitation through dignity. That night, around the barrack stove, Otto's fellow prisoners argued. Some said the Americans were trying to re-educate them. Others said kindness was just another weapon. Otto stayed quiet. He remembered the jacket that wouldn't lose its bloodstain, the laughter of Corporal Lewis, the weight of the 2 coins on his table. He didn't know if this was kindness or strategy. He only knew it was changing him. As the fire crackled, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this is how we start to live again, by repairing what we once destroyed." He returned to his bench and picked up a torn patch from a U.S. overcoat. The fabric was gray, coarse, unmistakably German. Somewhere along the line, the Americans had recycled captured uniforms into their own. He stitched it back in place, a gray square against green wool. It fit perfectly. When he held it up to the lantern, the contrast looked almost beautiful. 2 nations' cloths bound by a single seam. "Guess peace comes in gray and green," he murmured, echoing a joke he'd once heard. To everyone watching now, do you think healing comes from apology or from work? From words or from the quiet things we do when no one's watching? Tell me below. History remembers the loud victories, but maybe peace begins with a whisper, a needle, and the courage to mend what seems beyond repair. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, patient, rhythmic. Inside, Otto kept sewing. The gray and green patch held firm. Winter arrived quietly. The river froze along the edges, and the camp seemed to breathe slower. The tents had been replaced with wooden huts, their chimneys puffing thin streams of smoke into the pale December sky. The war was gone, but its echoes lived in the shuffle of boots on icy ground and in the letters that never came. Otto Krüger still worked at his small table beside the stove, sewing the last of the hospital uniforms. The Americans would soon leave, and the prisoners were told they'd be repatriated within the month. No one quite believed it until the trucks started lining up. On the morning of his departure, Otto sat alone at his bench. His scissors, once confiscated and later returned, lay open before him like wings. A young soldier entered the hut. Sergeant William Carter, barely 20, cheerful and full of energy that war had not yet aged. He wore a fresh uniform, pressed and neat, except for one missing button. "Could you fix this for me before I head home?" the sergeant asked. Otto nodded. His hands, rough and steady, threaded the needle one last time. The brass button bore the letters U.S. Army. He sewed it carefully, almost ceremoniously, as if fastening together two separate worlds. When he finished, the sergeant smiled. "You're good, old man. Better keep that skill when you go back." He reached into his pocket, pulled out another identical button, and placed it on the table. "For you," he said simply. Otto looked at it, small, polished, warm from the soldier's hand. A souvenir. He wanted to say something, but words felt clumsy, so he only nodded, and for a long moment, they stood in silence. The victor and the vanquished, linked by thread and understanding. When the truck horn sounded, Otto packed his few belongings, a spool of thread, his scissors, the notebook filled with fragments of diary entries, and the button. As he climbed onto the truck bed, he looked back at the hut, the seams on the curtains, the mended coats, the patched flags. They looked ordinary, but every stitch carried a story. Back in Germany, the ruins of Hamburg waited like open wounds. He reopened his old shop with a new sign above the door, Krüger and Son, tailor for all. There was no more black wool, no more eagles or medals, only civilian coats and school uniforms. Customers brought him their torn sleeves, their wedding suits, their Sunday jackets. Sometimes, an American soldier from the nearby occupation zone would walk in, asking for a repair. Otto never charged them full price. At night, he would open the drawer by his bed. Inside lay two relics, his Iron Cross from 1942 and the U.S. Army button from 1945. He would hold them both in his palm, the metal cool against his skin. One was for obedience, the other for redemption. He often wondered which one truly held his jacket together. Years later, when he was an old man, he would still dream of the steady rhythm of his scissors cutting cloth in that makeshift hospital. The sound was soft, almost like breathing, the sound of a man unlearning war. History rarely remembers the hands that mend. It remembers the hands that destroy, command, and salute, not the ones that hold a needle steady after the guns fall silent. Yet men like Otto Krüger remind us that wars end not with treaties, but with small, patient acts of repair. In the grand scale of World War II, his story is almost invisible. 6 years, 70 million lives lost, entire cities erased, and somewhere among them, one tailor cutting scraps of cloth for wounded men who no longer cared what flag they fought under. But perhaps this is how history survives, not only in marble memorials or military parades, but in quiet corners where an enemy's jacket is mended, where the fabric of hatred begins to fray. Otto's scissors cut through more than fabric. They sliced through the illusion that dignity belongs only to the victor. When the Americans paid him, they weren't rewarding labor. They were restoring equality, one coin at a time. When he stitched the two flags together, he wasn't creating art. He was repairing the air between enemies. Decades later, his shop's sign faded and the streets of Hamburg changed, but the rhythm he discovered that spring of 1945 never left him. Every time he heard the snip of scissors or the hum of a sewing machine, he remembered how healing first entered his life, disguised as work. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind, that redemption isn't found in apology alone, but in doing the work that peace demands. Thread by thread, stitch by stitch,